From eating raw cherries to contaminated water at the White House to getting assassinated in broad daylight. This is how every US president died and their final words. In spoiler, while some left an epic message, others talked about soup. But first, let's start at the beginning with George Washington, our first president, who got a serious throat infection after riding his horse in cold, snowy weather. He likely had epiglottitis, which is when the little flappy thing at the base of your tongue becomes inflamed. Today, that's an easy fix with antibiotics. But back then, doctors tried bloodletting, which is when they cut your arm and drain blood from your body. They thought it would somehow help, but it ended up making things way worse. And it's believed Washington lost 80 ounces of blood. That's like 6 Red Bulls. He told his doctor, "I die hard, but I'm not afraid to go." And as he struggled to breathe, his final words were, "'Tis well." But if you thought that was dramatic, this is the most insane coincidence in US history, where John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the second and third presidents, died on the exact same day. They started out as friends and revolutionary bros. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and Adams helped defend it. Quad quo. But in the election of 1800, the two became political rivals. Then, after a decade of not speaking, Adams and Jefferson reconnected as pen pals and became besties again. However, on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after signing the Declaration of Independence, the spookiest thing happened. Jefferson grew ill from diarrhea, pneumonia, and a kidney infection. And on the night before his death, he asked, "Is it the 4th?" When they told him not yet, he held on for one more day. And his final words were, "No, doctor, nothing more." Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Massachusetts, John Adams was a sickly 90-year-old man dealing with heart failure. Completely unaware that his bestie Jefferson died hours earlier, Adams said his famous last words, "Thomas Jefferson survives." It's kinda crazy that these two, who spent their whole lives being frenemies, ended up checking out on America's birthday. Kinda like our fourth president, James Madison, who almost completed the 4th of July trifecta. Because after dealing with congestive heart failure, the author of the US Constitution was on his deathbed, and doctors were trying desperately to keep him alive until July 4th. But when offered more stimulants by his niece, Madison said, "Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear. I always talk better lying down." Which basically meant he was ready to go, and died on June 28, 1836. I mean, come on, he was so close to making it to the 4th. But you know who did make it? The 5th president, James Monroe, who became the 3rd one to die on Independence Day. He had heart troubles which worsened after contracting tuberculosis. But his final words were about how he missed his old friend James Madison. "I regret that I should leave this world without again beholding him." And though most presidents die on their deathbeds, some die on the floor of Congress. Like the 6th president, John Quincy Adams, who after serving as president didn't retire to play golf, but instead went back to Congress as a representative. And while casting a no vote, he suffered a massive stroke, grabbing his desk and collapsing on the House floor. And after they carried him out, John Quincy Adams said, "This is the last of Earth. I am content." But some presidents have more peaceful endings, like Andrew Jackson, who is one of the most insane presidents in American history. He was a tough dude who fought in duels, survived the first ever presidential assassination attempt, and beat up his would-be killer with a cane. But despite all this, he didn't go down the way you might think. He got tuberculosis, had heart problems, and suffered from dropsy, which is when your body fills with too much water. Hydrate or dihydrate, am I right? And on his deathbed, surrounded by family, this tough guy turned into a softie, with his last words being, "Do not cry, be good children, and we shall all meet in heaven." And then there's Martin Van Buren, our 8th president, who struggled with asthma and heart problems. He died quietly at his fancy house called Lindenwold, with his last words being, "There is but one reliance," which was his way of expressing his trust in God. And while Van Buren lived a long 79 years, our next president holds the record for the shortest presidency because of this one dumb mistake. During his inauguration, William Henry Harrison gave an insanely long 2-hour speech in the freezing cold rain without even wearing a coat. And for over a century, we thought he caught pneumonia and died. However, recent studies suggest this probably wasn't the cause, because he didn't get sick until 3 weeks after the inauguration. Experts now believe he either died from typhoid fever or septic shock due to contaminated drinking water at the White House. That's insanely unlucky, because Harrison only lasted 31 days in office, which means his vice president, John Tyler, got a promotion. But this president didn't have the best record with the people. He was the only president whose death wasn't officially mourned by the country, because during the Civil War, John Tyler sided with the South. He was even elected to the Confederate Congress. But before he should start the job, he started having dizzy spells and died of a stroke, with his last words being, "Perhaps it is best." Agreed, John. Then there was James Polk, who died far too young at 53 years old. And it's because 3 months after leaving office, he was on a tour of the South where he contracted cholera, a nasty disease that gives you explosive diarrhea. But despite the circumstances, he went out as a romantic, with his last words to his wife being, "I love you, Sarah. For all eternity, I love you." I'm not crying, you're crying. But for this next president, you might be laughing, because Zachary Taylor died from eating too many cherries and drinking too much milk. Or did he? During a 4th of July celebration in the sweltering heat of DC, Zachary Taylor desperately needed to cool off. So he ran into the White House, ate a bowl of raw cherries, and drank several glasses of milk. The problem was, food safety was basically non-existent back then, and Taylor came down with gastroenteritis and died 3 days later. However, many believe Zachary Taylor was poisoned because he was the current president when this went down, and pre-Civil War tensions were rising. But when forensic scientists looked at his body in the 90s, they found nothing fishy. So it really was just some bad cherries. And before he died, Taylor said, "I'm about to die. I expect to summon soon. I've tried to discharge my duties faithfully. I regret nothing." And after death by cherries, VP Millard Fillmore stepped up to the plate. And unlike Taylor, Fillmore lived a long time after his presidency, until he had a stroke. But right before he died, someone gave him soup, and Fillmore said, "The nourishment is palatable," which basically means in fancy talk, it tastes good. 5 stars for the soup. But our next president had one of the saddest deaths ever. Just weeks before taking office, Franklin Pierce's son was killed in a horrific train accident. And this sent Pierce on a downward spiral of depression. He started drinking too much, became an alcoholic, and destroyed his liver with a disease called cirrhosis. He died after losing re-election, and nobody wrote down his last words, because he was all alone. Dang, that's sad. And unfortunately, the downward spiral of America continued with the next president, James Buchanan, who many view as one of the worst presidents because the Civil War was coming and he did nothing to stop it. Buchanan died of a bad respiratory infection, although some believe he fell victim to the mysterious National Hotel disease outbreak. But that's just rumors. He went out proclaiming, "O Lord God Almighty, as God wills." But you know what they say, weak men create hard times, and hard times create strong men. Which leads us to this tall drink of water with a top hat, Abraham Lincoln, one of the greatest presidents in American history. Although the Confederate South might disagree, because while watching a play at Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln was shot in the head by John Wilkes Booth, and unfortunately couldn't leave us with any words of wisdom. Instead, his final words were a casual reassurance to his wife in the theater box. She won't think anything about it. He was referring to what her friends might think of them holding hands at the theater. Scandalous. But after Lincoln's crazy assassination, VP Andrew Johnson took over, and he wasn't exactly popular. Congress tried to kick him out of the office with impeachment. And years later, Andrew Johnson died from 2 strokes he suffered while visiting his family in Tennessee. The second stroke left him paralyzed on one side, with his final words being, "My right side is paralyzed. I need no doctor. I can overcome my own troubles." And while some presidents were hated, others were celebrated as war heroes, like President Ulysses S. Grant, who led the Union forces to victory in the Civil War. But after his presidency, things took a turn for the worst, where Grant lost his life savings in a bad investment scam. Turns out some dude was running a Ponzi scheme. And to make matters worse, Grant was diagnosed with throat cancer, probably from all the cigars he loved smoking, sometimes 20 a day. Get this guy a nicotine patch. But before he died, Grant wanted to write his memoirs so his family wouldn't be broke after he passed. So he sat there every day writing as cancer ate away at his throat. And his last word was water. A simple request for a glass of water because his throat was so damn dry. Pretty crazy way to go out. But our 19th president, Rutherford B. Hayes, died like most of the others, at old age from heart failure. His emotional last words were, "I know that I'm going where Lucy is," referring to his wife who passed away 4 years earlier. But things got even crazier with our 20th president, James Garfield, who after being in office for 100 days was walking through a train station when a mentally unstable man stepped behind him and fired 2 shots. The first bullet grazed his arm. The second bullet was lodged in his back, but Garfield didn't die, because the bullet never hit any organs. Alright, however, it all went downhill when doctors stepped in. They probed around with unsterilized instruments and one even punctured his liver. So although Garfield initially survived, he suffered from massive infections over the next 80 days until he slowly died, with his last words being, "Swain, can't you stop the pain?" Poor guy was basically the victim of medical malpractice. Man, I hate Mondays. Garfield was succeeded by Chester A. Arthur, who eventually suffered from Bright's disease, which is kidney failure, and died from a stroke at 57. No definitive last words were recorded, but some say he whispered, "Life is not worth living." That's a bummer, because our next president was a dude living life to the fullest, Grover Cleveland, who was our 22nd and 24th president. You go, Grover! He died from heart failure at 71, with his last words being, "I've tried so hard to do right." And the president caught between Cleveland's two terms was Benjamin Harrison, who came down with a bad case of the flu, which progressed in pneumonia. And despite good medical care, his lungs failed. And his last words being, "Are there any doctors